primetime TV, when you hear the phrase foreign agent, you're usually in the world of fiction. It is not commonly thrown around by us in news discussions in primetime TV. I am having trouble getting used to it.
I know. And also, whenever I hear foreign agent, I think, oh, I'm probably going to like this show.
Yes.
Which hopefully is the case.
Right. Good location.
Yes.
All that stuff. Right? Thank you, Rachel.
Lawrence.
Well, today, one of Donald Trump's little lies, an important lie, but a little lie, was exposed by Sean Spicer, and one of his biggest, cruelest lies was exposed by a Republican who has figured out how many people will lose their health insurance thanks to Donald Trump, who promised that no one would lose their health insurance under his plan.
24 million more people would be uninsured in the next decade than under the current law.
If you're looking at the CBO for accuracy, you're looking in the wrong place.
We disagree strenuously with the report that was put out.
When they hear something they don't like, they label it a lie.
This is a political disaster for Trump if this thing actually goes through.
He said everyone will be covered and costs will go down.
We're going to be working to unleash the power of the private marketplace.
There are no free market insurance systems on Earth that work. There is not a single one, nor in any adjoining planets.
Everybody's going to be taken care of much better than they're taken care of now.
We now know that he had no intention of keeping either promise.
Nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated.
Everybody knew that. Everybody knew healthcare is complicated. Literally everybody.
Not all lies are created equal. Certainly not all Donald Trump lies. Lying about the size of his fortune, which he's done his entire life, was not a bigger lie than the lie he used to enter politics, the lie about President Obama's birth. That was a racist lie told to appeal to racists who had trouble sleeping at night with the knowledge that a black president was sleeping in the White House. That lie worked. All of those people, all of them, voted for Donald Trump, along with millions of other people who had no problem with a black president, but who fell for other Donald Trump lies. Here, measured in dollars, is, I think, Donald Trump's smallest campaign lie.
So, the first thing I'm going to do is tell you that if I'm elected president, I'm accepting no salary. Okay, that's not a big deal for me, but the next thing is... it's something that I'm going to show you in a minute, and it's a lie too, but that first thing, that he will accept no salary, that turned out to be a lie, and we learned today what he intends to do instead.
The president's intention right now is to donate his salary at the end of the year.
Don't think that's the same as accepting no salary. Now, I know you Trump voters thought he just wasn't going to accept the salary, and so that would be great. That would save the Treasury of the United States $400,000. The budget of the United States would be $400,000 richer thanks to Donald Trump, who doesn't need the salary. But no. He's going to take the $400,000. The Treasury's going to lose that money in the form of paychecks to Donald Trump and never get it back. And then Donald Trump promises to, and this is something he's never done before when he's made this promise, he promises to donate that $400,000 to charity. And if he does that, he will make the budget situation even worse because he will claim a charitable deduction, which will save him $158,400 in taxes. And so the Treasury will lose another $158,400. The total cost to the United States Treasury for having Donald Trump on the payroll as president will be higher than the cost to the Treasury of any other president in history
on the payroll. It won't just be the $400,000 paycheck. It will be $158,400 deduction plus the $400,000 paycheck. And so it will cost $558,400, which is not at all what you heard him say out there on the campaign trail when he said he wasn't going to accept the salary. So if you voted for Donald Trump because he wasn't going to take the salary, sorry. He's taking the salary. He's going to use it for a big tax deduction. That tax deduction alone is enough to pay for health insurance for 10 families who need it and can't afford it. And they will need that help even more than ever, because Donald Trump is not going to do a single thing, not one thing that he promised to do about health care on the campaign trail. Let's listen now to the next thing, the very next thing that Donald Trump said after he promised not to accept a salary.
The first thing I'm going to do is tell you that if I'm elected president, I'm accepting no salary. Okay, that's not a big deal for me, but...
Okay, sorry, I couldn't resist interrupting because it is pretty funny to hear him say that after you know what he's actually going to do with the paycheck and the tax deduction that he'll get with it. And so I just wanted to pause and re-enjoy that moment. But here's what he said next.
The next thing is, when these guys go to Congress, as per your question, when they go to Congress, a couple of things happen. First of all, they get benefits that nobody else can even think about, okay? And they don't like to talk about it. But we'll work on that. We have bigger problems than that because that's peanuts in the relative scale of how this country is being hurt. But we're going to work on that very hard.
So he promised all those people to work very hard on the problem, the big problem of members of Congress and senators getting benefits that no one else gets, like health care benefits. Now, there are two lies in that one. First of all, Congress gets regular employer-based health care that is virtually identical to the health care plans for employees of large corporations. There's nothing especially fancy about it. In fact, when I worked in the Senate, the health care plan was so unfancy that I did not use it because I had a much better, much cheaper plan from the Writers Guild. Members of Congress pay premiums out of pocket for health insurance just like everybody else. They pay deductibles, they pay co-pays, all of that. They're offered a standard big employer health insurance policy. So that's lie number one. Lie number two was that Donald Trump was going to do something about that. There is nothing in Donald Trump's health care plan that does anything about that. Paul Ryan's health insurance is not touched by Donald Trump or by Paul Ryan. Donald Trump wouldn't dare do that, and Paul Ryan would never dream of doing anything to personally share in the suffering of the people he willfully intends to harm, plans to harm, with that health care bill. Personal sacrifice has no place in Paul Ryan's personal philosophy. Paul Ryan is willing to sacrifice nothing in his health care plan. He could lead the charge to say, if we're going to take health insurance away from tens of millions of people, let's make sure that the first 535 of those people are right here in the House and the Senate. But that's not Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan is the highest paid member of Congress at $223,500. He has a wife, 3 children, and he is not prepared to risk their health insurance, and he should not be prepared to risk their health insurance. He should do everything he possibly can to protect their health insurance. But while he's doing that, he has a moral responsibility to try to protect the health insurance of even more vulnerable people. That is what Paul Ryan's religion teaches him. But he does not accept that interpretation of Catholicism, no matter how many members of the Catholic clergy believe that. When Paul Ryan looks at the federal budget, he sees the devil, and he wants to destroy it. He wants to hack away at it. He always has, and he always will. He wants to cut that budget, and nothing makes him prouder than cutting money from the federal budget that goes to programs that Republicans don't like, including the tiny amounts of money that go to funding for the arts and the large amounts of money
that go to supporting health care for poor people. And so the thing he is proudest about in this legislation is what it does to what his religion would call the least of our brethren.
This is so much bigger by orders of magnitude than welfare reform, because let me just describe exactly what this bill does for conservatives. This is why I'm so excited about it, and this is why I think people need to see the forest through the trees. We are defederalizing an entitlement, block granting it back to the states, and capping its growth rate. That's never been done before.
Correct.
That is cutting benefits to poor people through Medicaid more dramatically than those benefits have ever been cut before. The Congressional Budget Office issued its official estimate today for the Republican health care bill. It projects that 24 million people will lose their health insurance, which brings us to the biggest lie Donald Trump has ever told about health care.
Everybody's got to be covered. This is an un-Republican thing for me to say, because a lot of times they say, no, the lower 25%, they can't afford private. But universal health care. I am going to take care of everybody. What my plan is that I want to take care of everybody. I'm not going to leave the lower 20% that can't afford insurance.
Obamacare is collapsing, and we must act decisively to protect all Americans.
Now, Douglas Elmendorf. Joining us now, Douglas Elmendorf, American economist and dean and professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He was the director of the Congressional Budget Office from 2009 to 2015. Also with us, Andy Slavitt, former acting administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services from 2015 to 2017. Doug Elmendorf, you've been through these CBO estimates for healthcare plans. You can't envy the CBO having to struggle with this one. I want to get your reaction to what CBO projected today about this plan.
Well, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the number of Americans without health insurance would essentially double under this proposal, reversing all of the gains from the Affordable Care Act. At the same time, the federal government would save a lot of money on health insurance subsidies, which this legislation would use partly to roll back the tax increases in the Affordable Care Act, give more money back to higher income people, and partly to reduce federal borrowing.
And part of the way they save money is people who are subsidized up to amounts of, say, $12,000, $13,000 would only get a subsidy, if they got a subsidy at all, of $4,000 or less.
Right, so the subsidies people can get through these insurance marketplaces would fall by about half by the end of the 10-year window that CBO does its projections for. And even more importantly, a lot of people would lose Medicaid coverage because of the cutback in Medicaid spending. So through both the insurance marketplaces and through Medicaid, people would lose access to health insurance.
Andy Slavitt, let's get your reaction to the Medicaid piece of what you're hearing in this proposal.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lawrence. I think the simplest way to look at this proposal, and the CBO verifies this, is we're cutting Medicaid by about 25%. And to remind everybody what Medicaid does, Medicaid is a program that takes care of kids, low-income people, seniors in long-term care, and people who live with disabilities. That's it. So when you cut 25% from that, you really leave governors and states with very, very stark choices over which of those sets of people aren't going to get benefits, because states, as we know, have to balance their budgets every year, and with a cap and a cut, and I want to repeat that, they're not just cutting by 25%, but then they're saying we're going to limit the growth of Medicaid going forward. And of course, as I think you said earlier, and as Doug said, that's all to pay for about an $800 billion tax cut for corporations and wealthy Americans.
And one of the things that Sean Spicer kept saying today, Republicans keep saying, is that people who have coverage now under the Affordable Care Act don't really have anything. Doug Elmendorf, the way Sean Spicer kept saying it today is they may have a card, but they can't go to the doctors won't accept them. The doctors won't accept Medicaid patients. What is the truth about the interaction with the healthcare system that beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act experience when they try to get services?
People who have health insurance are more likely to be able to see a doctor when they need one. There's plenty of evidence about that. So these people who've gained health insurance through the Affordable Care Act have better access to doctors than they would have without health insurance. And if they go ahead with this proposal and those people lose health insurance, they will lose access to doctors that they have today.
Andy Slavitt, you've overseen the Medicaid program in particular. Today, Sean Spicer was saying that people on Medicare cannot get physician services because physicians turn down Medicare, but he was stressing that they turn down Medicaid patients all the time. What's the truth of that? What does that mean for Medicaid patients?
Well, the truth is that the Medicaid program and the Medicare program are two of the most highly valued programs in our country. You know, prior to Medicare and Medicaid, 1 in 3 seniors in this country live below the poverty level. 1 in 3. You know, today, because of Medicare and Medicaid, that's less than 1 in 10. These are really phenomenal programs. They've changed the country, and they've done that in ways that have glowing popularity. I think over 70% for Medicaid, close to 90% for Medicare, and that wouldn't happen if people weren't getting taken care of. And I think we have to remember that half the kids in this country that are born are paid for through the Medicaid program. And we have to really decide as a country if we really want to pass legislation that strips away all the funding to take care of all the kids that are born in this country, that are born healthy, in order for this very large tax cut.
Yeah, and the Republicans in their responses to this seem to be pretending that all Americans get to choose any doctor they want at any time, when in fact most of us have insurance plans that some doctors do not participate in and some doctors actually reject. And so the idea that everyone has the choice of any physician they want isn't true to begin with. I want to go to this point about premiums, and there's an indication in the CBO report that in the long run of this legislation, some premiums on the individual market would go down, or I shouldn't put this correctly, they would not increase as much as they would increase under the Affordable Care Act. But the report says in that spot that this is partially because of the change in the requirements for the health care plans that would be sold. And Doug Elmendorf, what they mean by that is these plans will be cheaper because they will have less benefits in them, and also young people can be charged a lot less for these health plans, and that older people will be charged much, much more. The older people's premiums will definitely go up higher.
Right, so there are two pieces of this. One is, as you say, that because of relaxation of rules in this legislation, health insurance plans would cover a smaller share of people's total costs. So part of the reason that premiums would go down is because people's out-of-pocket payments would go up. That doesn't make them better off on average. Those who don't get sick that year will be better off with lower premiums. Those who do get sick would pay more out of pocket. So on average, this reduction in the number of healthcare services, the amount of healthcare covered by the insurance plans, with lower premiums, but people would pay some of that out of pocket themselves. In addition to that, there is a change in the age structure of premiums. Under the Affordable Care Act, insurers can only charge older Americans 3 times what they charge younger Americans for these plans and insurance exchanges. Under this legislation, insurers could charge 5 times as much for older Americans as younger Americans. That'll tend to push up healthcare insurance premiums for older Americans substantially. So some younger Americans would have lower premiums under this legislation, but older Americans would have higher premiums and pay more in deductibles and co-payments when they need health care.
As Donald Trump has discovered, it's complicated. Douglas Elmendorf and Andy Slavitt, thank you both very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you.
Coming up, congressional Republicans reacting to the news of just how many people lose coverage under the health care bill. And Donald Trump continues to live his silent fear of reporters asking him about why he accused President Obama of tapping his phones. such a long list, but the thing they hate most is when the House votes for a bill that then dies in the Senate, especially when it's a controversial bill, because then the House members are exposed for having voted for that thing, and the senators get away with doing nothing. And now a senator, a Republican senator, is warning Republican House members that that's what will happen to them if they vote for the Trump health care bill. That's next. Republican Senator Tom Cotton is trying to do the House of Representatives a big favor by warning them not to walk the plank.
As it's written today, this bill in the House of Representatives cannot pass the Senate, and I believe it would have adverse consequences for millions of Americans, and it wouldn't deliver on our promises to reduce the cost of health insurance for Americans. So I would say to my friends in the House of Representatives with whom I serve, do not walk the plank and vote for a bill that cannot pass the Senate and then have to face the consequences of that vote.
Walk the plank. There it is. That is the concept the House of Representatives is always afraid of. Vote for something highly controversial only to see it die in the Senate. So you in the House of Representatives have taken the risk. You voted for the controversial bill. And in the end, it turns out you voted for nothing because it didn't pass the Senate. And then you in the House of Representatives live with the responsibility of that vote on Election Day, and not one senator lives with the responsibility for the bill dying in the Senate. And that is why it takes party discipline in both houses to pass anything, so that even when some members of the party trying to pass the bill disagree with elements of the bill, they must never say that publicly, because if they do, then the House of Representatives will get spooked and be afraid that all they're going to be doing is walking the plank. And so to have a Republican senator going on TV and warning them not to walk the plank is something we've never seen before with healthcare legislation. But then everything about the Republican healthcare bill is something we've never seen before. Joining us now, David Frum, senior editor for The Atlantic, and Indira Lakshmanan, Washington columnist for The Boston Globe. Indira, tell me how you get Tom Cotton to vote for this bill in the Senate. I just listened to what he said. He's as far away from that bill as Nancy Pelosi is.
Well, I mean, one reason he may be far away from that is, let's not forget that Arkansas, his state, is one of the states that saw one of the most dramatic increases in coverage under Obamacare for non-college educated whites. If you look across the country, there was a 39% increase between 2010 and 2015 in non-college educated whites' health care coverage. And from what the CBO released today, their analysis indicates that a lot of those same people, many of whom were in fact Trump voters, many of the old and many of the poor, are going to be most hurt by this Republican bill. So it's pretty interesting, and certainly Senator Cotton is probably aware that in his state a lot of people have benefited from Obamacare.
David Frum, this is the third major crusade we've seen in 3 different generations of members of Congress. The Clinton crusade for health reform that failed in 1994, the Obama crusade that succeeded. And in those previous 2,
no one in the Democratic Party wanted to be caught publicly criticizing the effort, even members of the Democratic Party who doubted the effort, because they knew if there were any cracks in the wall will collapse. And here you see Republicans with no inhibitions whatsoever about cracking that wall, and in Tom Cotton's case, trying to knock it down.
Tom Cotton is not alone. There's also Rand Paul, also from a state that, as Indira said, saw a huge increase in coverage among working class whites. And by the way, in Kentucky, the area where the coverage increased most dramatically also happens to be in the part of the state where Rand Paul's vote is most intensely concentrated. There are districts, there are counties where Rand Paul got over 80% of the vote, where a fifth of the people are covered now by the Medicaid expansion, just the Medicaid expansion. I think they are also at real risk of losing Senator Lee from Utah and Senator Cruz from Texas for different reasons. We have talked a lot about repeal and replace, but there is emerging some wisdom. The right place for a Republican senator to be is in the camp of what I call denounce and preserve. You attack the bill from the right. So no one can say you're a sellout or a rhino or a squish or anything like that. You attack it for maintaining a lot of the architecture of Obamacare. But the vote counters don't care why you voted the way you did. They just tally your vote. And if your vote is to preserve, you preserved it. And a lot of people in Arkansas or Kentucky, or let's not forget Louisiana, where there's also been a big increase of Medicaid enrollments. The Republican senator from Louisiana is also someone who's drifting away from this. As you said, this may never come to a vote in the Senate. It may never come to a vote in the House.
Yeah, and by the way, the Clinton bill never came to a vote on the floor of the House. These things and it looked very strong. It looked like it was moving. I mean, this is ancient history now. But it is easy to stop these things. And Indira, what's so fascinating about what David said is it is elementary Republican politics, that the safest way within the Republican world to attack this bill is from the right, because that will block any challenge to you in a primary from the right over this issue. That's not what I heard Tom Cotton say. Tom Cotton said he's worried about adverse consequences for millions of Americans, and it wouldn't deliver on the promise to reduce the cost of health insurance. But adverse consequences for millions of Americans is what Chuck Schumer, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Nancy Pelosi are worried about.
It's surprising to hear them using some of the same language. And also when the Congressional Budget Office, which is, let's face it, nonpartisan, and its director, Keith Hall, was appointed in 2015 by House Republicans, at which time the Health and Human Services Secretary, Tom Price, was the chairman of the House Budget Committee. So let's not forget that. And at that time, Donald Trump, who wasn't our president then, was tweeting out lots of negative CBO statistics about Obamacare at the time, so it's kind of hard to have it both ways. I think the really interesting political question now for the president is, remember, he campaigned on, we're going to make this coverage better, it's going to be cheaper, you're not going to lose your coverage, you're going to be able to go across state lines, there's going to be transparency in pricing, all of these great things. People aren't going to lose their coverage. In fact, this GOP bill, if you just look at it very sort of coldly and analytically, that's not what the CBO analysis says it's going to do. So I wonder whether, what President Trump himself will say about it at the end, if he's looking closely enough to see if it sticks to what his principles were.
And dear, I'm glad you mentioned Keith Hall, who is a Republican who was approved by Tom Price to be the head of the Congressional Budget Office. And we have a report coming out tonight indicating that inside the Trump administration, which would presumably be Office of Management and Budget, their own calculations indicated that even more people would lose health insurance than the CBO estimates so far. So these estimates are still a developing story. Indira Lakshmanan, thank you very much for joining us tonight. David Frum, we're going to talk to you in another segment. Thank you, Indira, very much. Appreciate it. Coming up, Donald Trump remains cowering in silence whenever a reporter speaks in his presence.
calling Donald Trump a liar.
I have been briefed on the matter, and I have seen no evidence that the tap occurred.
Back with us, David Frum. And David, there's the speaker saying he's been briefed on the matter, which is to say he has been presented whatever evidence there is, and there isn't any.
Yeah, but Donald Trump, he may not be a very strategic person, but he is very tactical. The fact is we have spent the week talking about this outlandish and, as far as anyone can tell, baseless charge the president threw out. And it did fulfill its purpose of distracting from, especially distracting the public, maybe not the news world, from the accumulated evidence of the collusion between the Trump campaign and people in the Trump campaign and persons in Russia. That story has gotten much less airtime in the past week, even as we've had a series of startling revelations about, for example, Roger Stone's connection to the WikiLeaks people and Julian Assange.
Yeah, and we did talk about Roger Stone last week on this program, but it is a very important point that he has, in effect, admitted that he was in direct contact, and there are others who've said that Roger Stone has been bragging about this for months, that he was in direct contact.
Well, the Washington Times reprinted some of the direct messages between WikiLeaks and Roger Stone. So Trump uses this method, and one of the ways to know what's on his mind is what he accuses people of is the thing he's afraid that people think he did. But it does sort of work, and there's no way it can't not work. He is the president, so when he says something untoward, people do have to pay attention to it, and you do have to operate on the assumption that if the president of the United States says something, it must be based on something. At least that's the convention of the press corps. You can't just shrug it off. But it buys him time, and a presidency is made up of a finite number of weeks. If any week he can get through with distracting from a scandal, just as, for example, today, Bloomberg had this astonishing story about the incredible infusion of cash into the Kushner family from a Chinese bank. The Kushner family's share of the debt was going to be relieved by 80%. People are describing it as a startlingly generous deal, but the healthcare news knocks that out of the headline. So, I've just referred to it, reference people to Bloomberg News, but in fact, there hasn't been time to talk about it in the shows tonight. And the Chinese bank is, of course, in all cases related to the Chinese government. It is impossible to think of them as separate entities. But he has created yet another. The Kushners are much richer than the Trumps, so they do business with China rather than having to make do with Russia. Right. But what Donald Trump has done with his tweet is create yet another scandal that Lindsey Graham is pursuing investigatively in his subcommittee on the Judiciary Committee, and that others are now pursuing. And so the idea of diverting scandal with scandal, that's a new one. Right. But the mission is to get these various questions into proper committees. It's pretty clear you're not going to get any kind of honest answer from the House Intelligence Committee. The Senate Intelligence Committee looks somewhat better. Lindsey Graham's, any committee that he runs will obviously be better still. If possible to have an outside independent body, that would be better yet, although that would require the president's signature, and so, at least for now, that's presumptively impossible. David Frum, thanks for joining us, and thanks for helping us keep our eyes on the many bouncing balls here. Follow the money. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Coming up, Donald Trump fired the U.S. attorney who has jurisdiction over these three things: Wall Street, Trump Tower, and Fox News. Now, guess which one of those Donald Trump wants to protect the most?
We have breaking news tonight. The New York Times is reporting now that, quote, a federal grand jury sitting in Manhattan is expected to soon hear testimony from at least 2 witnesses to testify in coming days about business practices at Fox News when it was led by Roger Ailes, Mr. Ailes, according to 2 people with knowledge of the matter. Mr. Ailes, who was forced out in July amid revelations of multiple accusations of sexual harassment, has denied those charges. The current inquiry, which began in September and appears to be in an early stage, may be focused, at least in part, on settlement payments, a person with knowledge of the matter said. That's all according to tonight's New York Times, post in tonight's New York Times. The federal investigation is taking place in the Southern District of New York. Preet Bharara was the U.S. attorney for that district, which covers Wall Street and the rest of Manhattan, including Trump Tower and the Fox News headquarters. In November, Preet Bharara met with Donald Trump during the transition. The president-elect asked Preet Bharara to stay on the job in his administration. Bharara agreed to stay, and then the day after, Sean Hannity urged the president to fire all of the remaining Obama appointees in the Justice Department. The president obeyed Sean Hannity and fired 46 U.S. attorneys, including Preet Bharara. Reports now indicate that Donald Trump will appoint Roger Ailes' lawyer, Mark Mukasey, as the next U.S. attorney with jurisdiction over Wall Street and Trump Tower and jurisdiction over that same Fox News investigation that the Times is reporting tonight. Previous reports had indicated that Preet Bharara was investigating Fox News for paying out multi-million-dollar settlements in sexual harassment cases without alerting stockholders. Gabriel Sherman of New York Magazine, who actually wrote the book on Fox News, and Roger Ailes will join us next. We're joined now by Gabriel Sherman, National Affairs Editor at New York Magazine and MSNBC contributor. He's the author of The Loudest Voice in the Room, How the Brilliant, Bombastic Roger Ailes Built Fox News and Divided a Country. And Gabe Sherman has apparently delivered Fox News into a federal grand jury investigation. We have, the New York Times is quoting basically two sources, unnamed sources, close to this information. And whether there's been a lot of speculation about whether this is the former U.S. attorney himself who wanted it out there to be known information that this investigation is underway, because stopping an investigation underway is much more difficult for Attorney General Jeff Sessions than stopping the beginning of one.
Of course. Now, this is a big story. You know, in the age of Trump, every story kind of gets overshadowed by Trump. But this is a big story because Fox News was Trump's loudest, most powerful media ally.
And still is.
And still is. And now his Justice Department is overseeing an investigation into the media network that helped make him the president. So this is going to be a test for Jeff Sessions about truly how independent this Justice Department is.
But since all of these proceedings are secret, grand jury and all that stuff, if the investigation goes nowhere, they're under no obligation to tell us why and how it ended.
Sure, and that, you know, that is a crucial part of our justice system, and we should trust the prosecutors in that office. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District is known for its independence. Now, I think if we see more leaks and there's a clear indication that prosecutors are feeling pressured, then we may know that some political shenanigans are going on.
Well, I mean, leaks in investigations like this are an indicator that the people involved in the investigation do not trust what the structure they're operating under, and they want us to know this investigation.
And we are seeing that in the early stages. And what we know now is that Mark Kranz, the former chief financial officer, as the Times reported tonight, is going to be testifying before the grand jury. And my sources inside Fox tell me that Mark Kranz, the former Fox News CFO, knows everything. He knows how Roger Ailes used the budget to move money around and perhaps cover up these sexual harassment payments. This is a big deal because if Kranz goes in there and he's given immunity, he will spill the beans and really deliver the goods.
Now, did he leave Fox News under friendly circumstances?
No, and this is what is really kind of fascinating. He was one of the only high-profile executives, in addition to Ailes, that left after the sexual harassment scandal. So he was cut loose, which, you know, in hindsight may have not been the smartest move by Fox, because now, according to the Times, he's going to be testifying against them before the federal grand jury.
And that was as a result of Fox News' own in-house investigation.
Yes, exactly. They cleared house only with a few top executives, Ailes and some of his lieutenants.
So they have someone out there, their former chief financial officer, who knows everything about this, who doesn't have particularly necessarily loyal feelings to the people who've been left behind.
That's what I've heard from my reporting, yes, inside the network, yes.
Gabriel Sherman, this is a big story. That's absolutely true. Gabe, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it. Coming up, David Duke found his presidential candidate in Donald Trump, and now he has a new hero in the Republican Congress, Steve King.
Steve King has catching some flack for a tweet he put up saying that we can't restore civilization with somebody else's babies. Does the White House have any reaction to that?
I will definitely touch base with the president on that and get back to you on that.
We're at this place now in America where we're seeing people marching in the streets that are pushing back against the American culture and the American civilization. And it's troubling to me that over the last 25 years, we've essentially phased out the promotion of assimilation, and we promoted instead multiculturalism and diversity as if it were our strength. And in fact, they're using it now to divide us, and that's what Barack Obama did throughout his presidency.
That was Congressman Steve King on Fox News tonight defending his tweet yesterday, which said, culture and demographics are our destiny. We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies. Today, Paul Ryan said he disagrees with Steve King.
I disagree with that statement. I haven't seen the context, but I disagree. We're a melting pot. Look, my family's here because the potatoes stopped growing in Ireland. This is what's beautiful about the American idea. I would like to think, and I haven't spoken to Steve about this, I'd like to think that he misspoke and it wasn't really meant the way that sounds.
Joining us now, Cristina Beltran, Director of Latino Studies at New York University and the author of The Trouble with Unity, Latino Politics and the Creation of Identity. Cristina, Paul Ryan wants to think that Steve King misspoke. Steve King insists he did not.
He did not, and he has a long history of statements like this. You know, Vox today just covered the variety of appalling things he said, racist things he said around immigration and everything else. So there's not an aspect here of this being misspoken. What always strikes me about this, it's so interesting, is that fundamentally what Steve King is doing is equating culture and demographics with civic life. It's an incredibly civically illiterate idea, because what makes the assumption here is that what makes us Americans is shared bloodlines, right? That we're like a shared Volk. Our peoplehood is connected to bloodlines, as opposed to the fundamental idea that, we are, you and I are Americans not because, I'm Mexican and Jewish. I am assuming you are not. But we are both Americans because we value the Constitution, we value the Bill of Rights, we value democratic, institutions and political freedom, right? And so the logic that Steve King is promoting here is the logic of ethno-nationalism, and it's the logic of white supremacy, and it's been his logic this entire, his political history has been defined by that kind of white supremacist language. And ultimately, what's really scary is what he's supporting, that kind of language, which has such a dark history in Europe and here. It's the language of Jim Crow. It ultimately is the logic of ethnic cleansing. It has the political logics of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So that kind of rhetoric is ultimately an idea that what makes us a people is shared bloodlines, as opposed to what makes us a people is a shared politics and a shared commitment to institutions. Unfortunately, he used to be a fringe element of Congress. Now, because of Trump, he's at the very heart of what Trumpian politics are today. So what was once a kind of fringe figure that we could blow off is now somebody who really has the ear of the administration in some really critical ways, and the administration themselves echo much of what he believes. believes. So this is a much darker statement, and it has resonances now that didn't even have, 6 months ago.
And, he seems to think he has in his head a definition.
Yeah.
Of who the somebody else's babies are and who the our babies are. And I would wonder in his head, where do the Trump babies fit? Since all but one of Donald Trump's children, the mother was an immigrant from a place that I'm not sure whether Steve King approves of or not, because he hasn't given us the list of the countries that he thinks produce our babies, even when it's from immigrant mothers.
Right, truly American babies.
Yeah.
Well, I think if they're white ethnic children, I think whiteness is so clearly central to this. But what's funny is he's partaking of a history that has a long.
There's no such line.
Right, but we've been and also the language that he is speaking, it has such a long history. We've been talking about this since we were afraid that the Irish were papists, that Jews couldn't assimilate, that this has been a complaint historically. Every group that comes in from Eastern Europe was questionable. So this is a long history, but ultimately for him is an assumption that certain people are truly American by blood as opposed to by values and ideas.
Yes, and they all have tribe names that he cannot pronounce, and they were all here thousands of years before anyone named King lived in this country. Christina Beltran, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. The 11th Hour with Brian Williams starts right now.
Tonight, two major stories, both of the big questions surrounding the White House 10 days after the explosive allegation that he was